I broke up with my ex and watched him cry and beg, but I was already with Brian, the most popular guy in the neighborhood. Now Brian got me pregnant and left, so I went to my ex to give him a chance to take me back. I arrived at Esteban's door with my belly tight under my shirt, pride tightening my throat, and a brilliant idea that in my head was an elegant deal. I knocked as if I still had rights in that house, as if the 4 years between us were a bad dream that could be erased with willpower. When he opened the door, I saw him with the face of a man who has already weathered the storm, and I felt a strange anger, because he was supposed to break when he saw me, not look whole. He held my gaze as if I were an uncomfortable visitor, not the woman of his life returning home. And yes, I'm going to explain how we got to this point. For years ago, Esteban was my boyfriend and also my routine, and for me that's a dangerous mix. He was one of those men who love calmly, with fidelity, with proper plans, as if love were a good conduct contract. At first I liked that because it felt safe, because I could be the queen and he the devotee. And everyone saw that I had someone who treated me as a priority. But over time, security started to feel like boredom, and boredom for me is a form of emotional disrespect. I wasn't born to live in energy-saving mode. I need something to happen inside me. And Esteban, although he was good, started to seem too predictable. It's not that he was bad, it's that he settled for little and expected me to settle too. He'd talk to me about the future as if the future were going to repeat the present, and that gave me a claustrophobia that I couldn't explain without being looked at as capricious. I tried to give him hints, to provoke small tensions to see if he would react, and he responded with more patience, as if his patience were a currency that would buy me eternal love. Sometimes he would cry over minimal things for fear of losing me, and that should flatter anyone, but it made me feel trapped. Because when a man loves you as if you were his salvation, he puts a weight on you, and I didn't ask to be anyone's altar. I just wanted to feel alive. Esteban also had that correct man energy, the kind the neighborhood applauds, but that doesn't ignite anything. He went about his business, worked, came home, took care of me, asked me if I'd eaten, as if I were a fragile child. And I'd look at him and think I was turning into a lady before my time. I wanted excitement, looks, a beautiful danger, that adrenaline that makes you feel like the world is watching you. With him, the world wasn't watching. The world took it for granted. And I didn't want to be the same old girl. I wanted to be the one nobody dares to lose. That's why my head started looking for stimulation outside of the domestic. In that same neighborhood where Esteban was the stable man, there was Brian, who was something completely different. He was the popular one, the one everyone respected, the one who moved as if the rules were suggestions. It wasn't just physical, it was presence. It was that way of entering a place and the place changing temperature. People started talking to me about him as if he were a legend. I'm sorry, but I've always understood that status is also a language. Being with someone like him wasn't just about liking a guy, it was about leveling up in the eyes of the world. And I, although people act like moralists, know that everyone cares how they look, it's just that I admit it. I started to feel a curiosity that seemed innocent, but was actually a hunger for excitement. When I saw Brian from afar, it wasn't just attraction, it was the feeling that with him there wouldn't be that calm that bored me with Esteban. With Brian, I didn't imagine quiet Sundays, I imagined stories, I imagined looks, I imagined that kind of love that messes up your makeup. And even though Esteban loved me, his love was no longer enough, because it was a love that stayed on the surface of day-to-day life. I wanted something that would shake my identity, not something that would give me peace to sleep. Besides, I'm not going to lie, I was seduced by the idea of people knowing I was with the leader of the neighborhood. That changes how they treat you, it changes your energy, it changes the place you occupy. When I decided to leave Esteban, I had already made the decision, and the rest was an emotional formality. He felt it coming like men who depend on you do, and that's why he broke down with an intensity that seemed excessive to me. He begged, pleaded, cried. He got on his knees as if the floor could convince me, and that scene gave me a strange mix of discomfort and superiority, because if I was leaving, it was because I needed to grow, and he turned it into a personal tragedy, as if I had to carry his drama forever. I told him it was for the best, that it was necessary, that I couldn't breathe like that, and he insisted he would change, that he could be different. But the truth is I didn't need a different Esteban. I needed to get out of that proper life, and I did. People always want to paint that moment as if I were cruel, but nobody talks about how suffocating it is to feel that your life is already written. I left because I wanted adrenaline and because love isn't just good manners, it's feeling something strong. Esteban cried as if the world were ending, and I, although it sounds harsh, saw it as the reaction of someone who had lost control. He wasn't crying for me just out of love. He was crying because his security was gone, and that's not my responsibility. I had the right to seek what I deserved because a relationship isn't charity, it's an exchange. If I gave presence, image, energy, I should also receive excitement, not just stability. And that exchange with Esteban no longer filled me. With Brian, everything was fast, because with men like that, things aren't built slowly, they're consumed. He gave me that feeling of belonging to something big, of being at the center of a story that the neighborhood talks about. I would walk with him and feel that they looked at me differently, that I was the chosen one, and that validation fed me in a way that Esteban never understood. With Esteban, I was the girlfriend. With Brian, I was the popular guy's woman. And that sounds superficial, but social life works like that, even if they don't admit it. I convinced myself that I was doing the right thing for me, because I can't live halfway. Besides, I kept telling myself that Esteban would get over it, because the one who truly loves you also has to learn to let you go. If he can't, that's his emotional work, not mine. Months passed, and I continued to live that status movie with Brian until reality cut in like a knife. I got pregnant, and at first I saw it as a confirmation of destiny, as a sign that life was settling into my new stage. I'm not going to pretend I was scared like a helpless victim. I thought about solvency, about structure, about the future. Because when a woman is pregnant, the world starts to judge you with a magnifying glass. I needed Brian to respond like the important man he claimed to be. I needed him to live up to his own character, because that's the minimum when you get involved in someone's life. But Brian turned out to be a coward. As soon as he found out about the pregnancy, he disappeared off the map as if the entire neighborhood had swallowed him. And that's when I understood the difference between being popular and being responsible, because being popular is easy when you don't have to answer for anything. I was left with a growing belly and silence as an answer. And that's not romantic, that's abandonment. And of course, people then say, "Why did you get involved with him?" As if I had a crystal ball. But nobody gets involved with someone thinking they're going to leave you high and dry. I wasn't asking for a palace, I was asking for the basics: solvency, presence, support. If he was the respected one, he had to act like it. With the pregnancy upon me, I started to think about reality coldly, because love doesn't buy diapers. I needed security, and security is a right when you're carrying a future in your body. And there, no matter how much it shocks people, Esteban appeared in my mind as a logical option. Not because I missed him, but because he always loved me, and his love, although boring, was constant. He was the type of man who would break his back for someone, even if they humiliated him, and that, in practical terms, is valuable. I thought that if anyone was ever going to take responsibility without questioning too much, it was him. And I also thought that for him it would be a golden opportunity, because there are men who dream of having you even in a complicated version. Sometimes life brings you back to where you know there are resources. I prepared to go to his house like someone going to present a business, not like someone going to beg. In my head it was simple. He gets closeness with me, and I get stability. It's not that I'm selling myself as merchandise, it's that in adult life everything has a cost, even affection. I told myself that in the end Esteban always wanted a version of me, and I could give it to him under clear conditions. Besides, 4 years had already passed, and 4 years is enough for people to mature and stop being resentful. If he still loved me, that doesn't just go away, it just transforms. I convinced myself that what I was going to propose was fair and even generous, because I could have ignored him forever. I also clung to an idea that works for me to survive the things I don't like to remember. I repeated to myself just once as an internal rule that if I decide not to carry certain memories, those memories have no power over me. Because my mind is my territory. I'm not saying it as a joke. I'm saying it because living with someone else's guilt is living as a slave. I wasn't obligated to relive every tear of Esteban's if it no longer served me. I needed to look forward and solve my present, because a pregnancy doesn't wait for you to have moral peace. And if Esteban wanted a new beginning, this was the perfect time to make it useful. When I arrived at his house, I didn't go with a look of defeat. I went with a look of proposal. I stood in front of his door thinking about all the times he cried for me, about everything he said he would do for me, and it seemed logical that now he should prove it. I knocked and took a deep breath, because even though I felt confident, I knew this was going to be a loaded scene. When he opened the door, I saw him different, firmer, less pleading, and that bothered me a little because I was expecting that old tremor, but I held my ground because I wasn't going to lose control of the situation over an aesthetic expectation. I got straight to the point with that elegant coldness of someone who can't waste time on useless emotions. I offered him personal services in exchange for him supporting me and taking care of the child, because sometimes you have to speak plainly for people to understand. It wasn't a humiliation for me, it was a deal. He gets companionship, access, that fantasy he always had with me, and I get security. I presented the idea to him as something fair, as a balanced exchange, because at the end of the day he had loved me with a devotion that seemed infinite. This was his golden opportunity to have me close again, even if it was in a format that might seem strange to others. I was sure that if he was smart he would see it as an investment, not an insult. And there the moment ended where everything was up in the air, waiting to see if Esteban was going to act like a man or a wounded person. Comments from the main story. Anonymous user 1 says, "You didn't go to offer a deal, you went to spit in Esteban's face a second time, only now with a belly and a hunger for solvency. You left him 4 years ago while he was crying on his knees. And now you come back talking about personal services as if it were a menu, and on top of that you say it's his golden opportunity. It's also sick that you're treating the baby as part of the negotiation, as if the child were an accessory to tie down a stable man after the popular guy abandoned you. And erasing the 4 years with a little radio catchphrase is a pathetic excuse to not accept that you humiliated him." Response from the OP. How dramatic you get when a woman speaks clearly about what she needs, as if life were solved with poems and not with security. Esteban isn't an eternal victim. He made decisions. He chose to love me that strongly, and I didn't ask him to kneel or break down. That was his way of handling abandonment. I came back because I need structure. Yes, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise for you to applaud me morally, because my belly isn't fed by your opinion. The deal is fair because he always wanted to be with me, and I'm giving him a real way to have me close, not an adolescent illusion. And if it bothers you that I don't torture myself remembering every tear, it's because you like to see women punishing themselves so others can feel superior. Anonymous user 2 says, "The funniest part is you call getting with Brian's status, and then you're surprised when he disappears when he gets you pregnant. So you chose the popular guy thinking that was leadership. Then you come to Esteban as a backup plan, as if he were an ATM with feelings, and you wrap it up in the language of exchange to make it sound elegant. On top of that you say he should support the child because it's his opportunity. What a level of shamelessness. Esteban cried for you 4 years ago. Yes, but it seems the only thing you learned is to use that as a tool when it suits you." Response from the OP. You all love to talk as if you've never desired something for how it looks from the outside, as if the world didn't work with hierarchies and symbols. I didn't get pregnant alone, and if Brian disappeared, that speaks about him, not my value. So don't come to me with selective morality disguised as a lesson. Esteban isn't an ATM. Esteban is a man who always wanted to build with me, and I'm giving him a concrete option, not a dream, because reality also needs agreements. If it hurts him, he can say no, but don't paint me as a monster for proposing a solution when I'm in a critical situation. What's shameless is that the world expects me to sink with dignity while the men who promise everything leave without paying for anything. Update 1. It's been a week since the last update, and the only thing I'm going to remember from the previous moment is that Esteban let me into his house, but not for what I thought. That week left a bitter taste in my mouth because I went with a practical proposal, and he responded with a coldness that doesn't resemble the man who cried for me. I expected his old love to work like an automatic door, but I found something worse, an Esteban who learned to see himself as superior, and when a man who once begged now feels powerful, he becomes cruel with style. The first day he let me in, I noticed that his house no longer had that sad place energy. It had structure, order, and a different kind of calm. That disconcerted me because I came prepared for an emotionally weak Esteban, not for someone who moves as if he has control of his life. He let me pass as one lets pass someone who is going to sign a document, with distance, without that tremor that used to betray him. I sat down and felt the weight of my belly as a reminder that time doesn't wait. I wanted to regain closeness quickly, because in these situations the emotion cools down if you don't push it. And my mind started to plan how to get back the place I knew I once had in him. I kept telling myself that if he let me in it's because there was still something, because a man who has truly moved on doesn't open the door. To me it was obvious that his rejection was a posture, an attempt to act strong, because men love to act like rocks after having been water. I interpreted his silences as provocation, as that make-me-beg strategy that some learn when they realize that begging humiliates the other. And I wasn't going to beg, but I was going to remind him of what was at stake. Because if he was going to act as if I were a stranger, I had to reactivate the desire with something more direct, not out of desperation, but for efficiency. That's why, halfway through the week, I decided to do what smart women do when a man becomes distant: give him an image he can't ignore. I started sending him photos of myself in lingerie with my belly while he was at work, because if his mind had cooled down, it had to be warmed up with reality. I didn't do it with shyness, I did it with authority, because I wasn't asking for free affection, I was offering a service within an agreement. I wrote to him with that serious, joking tone, reminding him that the customer is always right, because I needed him to understand that this was an exchange, not a favor. I even thought it was generous, because not everyone shows themselves vulnerable and desirable at the same time, and I, even with a belly, was still me. When I sent those photos, I felt a mix of power and nervousness, because a part of me knew I was pushing a line, but I also thought that if he still loved me, those images would disarm him, just as my mere presence used to disarm him. I imagined his reaction, his breathing changing, his mind returning to what our past was. I thought he would respond with urgency, with words, with something that would confirm that the thread was still there. I even thought he would feel flattered, because let's be realistic, it's not every day that your pregnant ex gives you explicit attention. I wanted to activate his rescue instinct, the one that made him feel important with me, and in my head that was inevitable. The response I received was humiliating for how cold and calculated it was. Esteban didn't respond like a tempted man. He responded like a man who wants to crush you without getting his hands dirty. He forwarded the photos back to me, and when I saw that I thought for a second it was a mistake, that maybe he sent them to himself until I saw the note that came with them. It said he wasn't a customer of sale items, a dry, cruel phrase, designed to reduce me to discounted merchandise. That kind of comment isn't meant to set boundaries, it's meant to make you feel cheap. And the worst part is that by forwarding them he made it clear to me that he was willing to expose me even without needing to. In that instant, I felt a heat in my face that wasn't normal shame, it was rage with humiliation. Because I wasn't harassing him for sport, I was trying to reactivate an agreement that he allowed by opening the door. If he didn't want anything, he could have said it like an adult, not return my photos as if they were trash. That gesture made me feel that I was losing power in front of a man who used to not be able to look at me without crying. And that's hard to swallow because it means the world moved on without you. I wanted to respond with an immediate attack, but I held back because I sensed that he wanted me to explode. He was playing at being the right one, and I didn't want to give him that scene. What finally hit me like a ton of bricks was finding out about his current life from the way he said it, like someone showing you a trophy. It turns out he now owns a construction company, and he didn't mention it with nice pride. He mentioned it with that "look what I am without you" tone. I felt a mix of disbelief and anger, because while I was surviving with a belly and a man who disappeared, he was literally building his empire. That contrast is unfair on a cosmic level, because the one who cried for me now had solvency and calm. And that's when I understood that my proposal, which in my head was logical, could sound to him like a late intrusion, but that didn't take away my right to try to solve my present. It just complicated the board. Then he dropped the final bomb as if it weighed nothing. He has a fiancée who is a model. When I read that, I felt a strange pang, not of romantic jealousy, but of a wounded ego, because I don't like to imagine him choosing someone who looks perfect after me. A model, I mean, someone who in the social imagination is valued for their image, precisely the territory where I have always known how to play. It seemed like a direct provocation, as if he wanted to tell me that now he can have an improved version of what I represented. And that made me angry because I don't consider myself replaceable, I consider myself unique, but I also felt a new fear, because if he was already so high up, his ability to crush me was real. That fear became concrete when he asked me to stop harassing him, or he would use his influence so they wouldn't give me free care at the neighborhood hospital. That phrase was like a low blow with a smile. Because touching a hospital when you're pregnant is touching the most basic terror. I'm not naive. I know how things work when someone has money and contacts, and I don't have the margin for them to close medical doors on me because of a personal conflict. He wasn't just rejecting me, he was threatening to take away my survival resources. And that's not moving on anymore, that's punishment. I wanted to scream at him that it was cruel. But he wasn't in front of me at that moment. He was far away, safe, in his world. And distance makes threats feel more real. I spent that night going over every move, every message, every photo, wondering if I had crossed a legal line or if he was exaggerating to scare me, because there are men who, when they discover they have power, they use it like a whip to feel invulnerable. I hated myself a little for having given him material with the photos, because although my intention was logical, he transformed it into evidence of harassment. And when someone transforms your desire into a crime, it changes the ground under your feet. I started to imagine my arrival at the hospital, my name on a list, the look of a nurse treating me like a problem. That image made me sweat cold because for the first time the game stopped being emotional and became institutional. I also started to think about the model fiancé, not as a person, but as a symbol. If Esteban married her, he would consolidate his new life as a prize, and I would be left as an embarrassing anecdote that appears in stories to warn others. That type of narrative disgusts me because it turns a woman into a lesson and a man into a hero without anyone seeing the ugly parts. I wanted to regain control of that story, but at the same time I had to be smart because I was no longer dealing with a vulnerable Esteban. I was dealing with an Esteban with money, with influence, and with a desire to see me far away. And when someone has a desire to see you far away, you should watch your step. A few days later, I realized that my presence in his life was no longer an open door. It was a threat to him, and that placed me in a strange position. On the one hand, I was indignant because I still believed that he owed me at least humanity after how he loved me. On the other hand, I was scared because if he really pulled strings, I would be exposed at the worst time of my life. I started to think that maybe I should look for another strategy, another person, another way to secure myself, because the Esteban route was proving to be more dangerous than useful. And that hurt my ego, because I hated to accept that someone who used to beg could now close the world on me, but it also activated my survival instinct, and survival always wins. That week I ended up with a bitter feeling of partial defeat and a huge problem on my hands. I needed safe medical care, and I already had Esteban threatening with his influence. Besides, my pride was wounded by the rejection and by the sale items phrase that stuck with me like an insult with a price tag. I was left thinking about how to react without worsening my situation, because any misstep could cost me more than a broken heart. And while I was trying to calculate, a shadow reappeared in my head as a possible trigger for chaos. Brian, because in neighborhoods like mine, those who disappear sometimes come back when you least want them to. And I, with a belly and no safety net, wasn't ready for what a return like that could unleash. Comments from the update. 1. Anonymous user 1 says, sending lingerie photos with a belly to your ex while he's working and finishing with the customer is always right, is literally harassment disguised as a joke. On top of that, you get indignant because he forwards it back to you with, I'm not a customer of sale items, when you yourself treated him as a customer and yourself as a product. Only the shot backfired, and now you're surprised that he has a construction company and a model fiancé, as if the world had to freeze for 4 years to wait for you. The most disgusting thing is that you use the pregnancy as an argument of "you owe me humanity," when what you're trying to do is buy support with sex. Response from the OP. How easy it is to say harassment when it suits you to paint a man as an eternal victim, but no one mentions that he let me in and placed himself in a position of power to then humiliate me with style. I use the language of customer because it was a practical agreement, not because I see myself as an object, but because real life works with exchanges, even if you want to put on a moral play. The sale items phrase wasn't a boundary, it was cruelty, because he wanted to reduce me and make me feel less just when I'm vulnerable. And that doesn't make it elegant, no matter how much you want to hate me. That he has a construction company and a model fiancé doesn't surprise me out of jealousy. It infuriates me because of the contrast, because he is rewarded for having been the supplicant and I am punished for surviving. And yes, he owes me humanity, because humanity isn't cancelled when it's convenient for you to be successful. Anonymous User 2 says, the best plot twist is that you want to offer personal services and now you're crying because they're treating you like merchandise. I mean, you opened that door yourself. You thought Esteban was still on his knees 4 years later, and it turns out he now has power, money, and even threatens with his influence so they won't treat you at the hospital, which is horrible, but you brought it on yourself by insisting. It's also clear that it stings you that his fiancée is a model because your ego can't stand that he replaced you with someone perfect. And the thing about suddenly being afraid of the institution is comedy, because before you didn't care about humiliating anyone, now you care that the system punishes you. Response from the OP. I'm not crying because they're treating me like merchandise. I'm indignant because he took my practical proposal and turned it into an excuse to trample me with superiority, which are different things. I opened the door to negotiate, not for him to exhibit me and return my photos as if they were trash, because that speaks more about his need for revenge than my intention. That he uses threats with the hospital isn't horrible, but you brought it on yourself. It's an abuse of power. And saying it so lightly shows how little you care about a woman when she's in real danger. And yes, I care about the system now because when you're pregnant the margin becomes minimal, not because I'm comfortable, but because life squeezes you and forces you to prioritize. If you find comedy in a person being afraid of being left without medical care, then you're not giving an opinion, you're enjoying the punishment. Update 2. It's been 3 weeks since the last update, and to not repeat the obvious, I was still pregnant, with the hospital threat floating like a knife, and with Esteban acting as if I were an embarrassment he had already filed away. I had tried to recalibrate the situation, watch my steps, not give him extra material, but in the neighborhood things don't stay still just because someone wants calm. I still had that mix of pride and need that makes you walk with your head held high, even if inside you're trembling. And just when I was trying to maintain my dignity on a board that was already closing on me, the universe decided to bring back the original problem. Sometimes the neighborhood works like a stage where characters return when you most want them to be dead. I was at Esteban's door, not because I wanted to insist for sport, but because I needed clarity. You can't live pregnant with medical threats without knowing what ground you're on. And I wanted to make sure he wasn't going to use his influence as a whip. I stood there with the idea of talking logically, even if my ego was burning. Esteban wasn't outside, and that gave me a breather because I had already learned that he knows how to humiliate with the precision of someone who feels untouchable. I took a deep breath, mentally prepared myself not to break down, and at that moment I heard a scream that made my back bristle. It was a sound that you can't mistake for anything else when you've heard it before. Brian returned to the neighborhood as if he had never disappeared, with that energy of a man who thinks the world is waiting for him. I saw him approach with a lit gaze, and a mix of rage and panic hit me, because there is nothing more outrageous than seeing a coward walking with confidence. He saw me there at Esteban's door, and the scene set itself up, as if the neighborhood had been waiting for that clash. He started to make a scene, to complain, to talk loudly so everyone could hear. Because he has always been more show than substance. I felt the windows with eyes, the street with ears, and my stomach tightened because I couldn't afford another public humiliation. At that moment, I knew he wasn't coming to fix anything. He was coming to mark territory with noise. Brian got closer, and although I'm not going to dramatize by saying I was going to faint, I did feel the threat of the unpredictable. There are men who, when they shout, are just looking for attention, but he had that tone of someone who enjoys scaring others to feel big. I tried to stand firm because if they see you back down, they eat you alive, and I was tired of the world swallowing me without chewing. He talked about the pregnancy as if it were a joke, as if my body were a stage for his ego, and that filled me with a cold fury. I wanted to tell him things that are not said out loud. I wanted to rip off his popular mask. But the neighborhood doesn't reward the woman who complains, it rewards the man who puts on a show. I knew that, and that's why I stayed, that's why I endured, that's why I focused on surviving the scene without giving him my breakdown. People started to watch more, to get a little closer, to pretend they were just passing by, and I hated that feeling of being in a ring without having chosen to fight. Brian got in my face, not necessarily touching me, but occupying space as if his body were a sentence. I thought about my belly, about the baby, about my need not to get into trouble that would later close medical doors on me. He was saying things that were meant to make me look like the one who goes around looking for men with money, as if he hadn't disappeared when it suited him. And suddenly I understood that he didn't want to reconcile. He wanted to punish me for being at another door, for looking for support where he had failed. That's the most typical thing in that type of men. They abandon without guilt, but they get offended if they see you trying to survive. In the middle of the scandal, Esteban's door became the center of the fight, even though Esteban wasn't even there. I felt the place burning under my feet because it was as if the entire neighborhood was witnessing my worst summary. Brian turned up the volume, and I saw how that little ball of morbid curiosity formed around us, that hunger for other people's stories. At that moment, my brain did what it does when it feels cornered. It looks for an emotional lifesaver. And the most immediate lifesaver was obvious, even if it was absurd, because Esteban was always the man who would jump when I said, "Help." I needed someone to get me out of that scene. Not for love, for damage control. That's when I made a decision that many will call manipulation, but I call it a survival strategy. I told Esteban as soon as I managed to get him to open the door or pay attention to me from inside that Brian wanted to kill me. I didn't say it like a novel. I said it like an alarm, because I needed to activate the hero instinct he always had with me. I wanted Esteban to come out, to stand firm, to cover me, to get me out of that ring with his correct man presence. It wasn't a whim. It was a way of forcing the universe to balance the forces, because alone against Brian and the neighborhood watching, I was losing. Besides, if Brian was there putting on a show, his energy was indeed dangerous, even if he didn't have a weapon, because danger doesn't always come in a literal form. I needed Esteban to react like he used to, even if it was just once, because that reaction was my way out. In my head it was perfect. Esteban would come out, Brian would be intimidated, and the neighborhood would see that I wasn't alone. Even if Esteban didn't love me, his decent man pride would make him defend a scene of threat. I was counting on that masculine morality, that need to be seen as the protector, because that has always been his identity. It even seemed fair to me because I had been a part of his life, and he always said he would take care of me even if we weren't together. I was trying to activate an old promise, and if that's using someone, then the whole world uses promises all the time. I just needed it to work once to get out of that sidewalk in one piece. The problem was that Esteban was no longer the man I remembered in his kneeling version. Esteban didn't come out as a hero. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand in front of me. He didn't make a scene. Esteban did something much worse for how cold it was. He called the police. I saw his movement from the door. That bureaucratic calm of someone who has already learned that authority solves things without getting your hands dirty. He didn't look at me like someone to protect. He looked at me as part of the problem to be removed. And that feeling was like a blow because for a second I understood that I no longer had access to his emotional impulse. I had tried to activate it with an alarm, and he turned it off with a phone number. The distance between what I expected and what he did left me frozen. The police arrived and the neighborhood settled in to get a better look, as always, as if it were a free show. Brian was still upset, still in his wounded macho mode, and I was trying to maintain my composure because they were watching me too. Esteban from his door seemed relieved, as if he could finally clean his sidewalk without talking to me. I felt a rage rising in my throat because in my mind I had asked for defense, and he had responded with expulsion. It was as if he were telling me, without saying it, that I no longer deserve to be saved, that I only deserve to be managed. And when a woman feels managed, something internal breaks, even if she looks still on the outside. The cruel irony was that Brian ended up arrested for an old warrant, something that had nothing to do with me and at the same time had everything to do with it. I saw him in handcuffs and for a second I thought the universe was finally setting a real limit. But that satisfaction is short-lived when you remember that you're still pregnant, without solvency, and with your life in disarray. Brian left shouting, promising things, saying he was going to come back, as if prison were a pause and not a consequence. I was left there with the police asking me questions, with people watching, with Esteban hidden behind his door as if my presence stained his facade. And the worst part is that, even though Brian was the one arrested, I wasn't free. I was in the middle of the paperwork. They asked me to go to the police station to make a statement, and that phrase sounds simple, until you're living it with a belly and no money. I felt that helplessness of your life becoming a formality without them consulting you. They put me in a patrol car as if I were part of the incident. Not necessarily guilty, but part of the package. I looked out the window and felt the city getting smaller, as if every corner had a memory of my stumbles. I thought about calling someone, but who? If Esteban had already decided that I was something to be removed from the sidewalk. My family wasn't a network, it was judgment, and Brian was smoke with handcuffs. So I breathed and swallowed my pride, because sometimes the only thing you can do is endure the process. At the police station, everything was harsh light and other people's patience, and there I was with my belly, feeling out of place as if my life were just another case. They made me tell what happened and I had to measure every word because in those spaces interpretation can crush you. I couldn't sound dramatic because then they say you're exaggerating, but I also couldn't sound cold because then they say you're lying. It's exhausting to have to act, right? When you're on the edge. I said I felt threatened, that Brian arrived agitated, that there was a scandal and I saw how they took notes with that calm that reminds you that your fear is not a priority. I felt alone in an almost physical way, as if the air weighed more. The most humiliating part was leaving there and not having anyone waiting for me. There was no message from Esteban asking if I was okay. There was no hand. There was no "you're here." There was nothing. I had the feeling that for him I was a risk, not a person. And that loneliness brings out a rage you don't know where to put because you can't fight with institutional walls. Besides, I was broke because in situations like these everything becomes an expense, everything becomes transportation, everything becomes wasted time. I felt that life was charging me interest for every decision I made, and I didn't have an account to pay them. And that, although it sounds melodramatic, is a reality when you're about to give birth and your world is falling apart. I left with a heavy belly and a head full of questions that had no answers. What was going to happen with Brian when he got out? If he really stayed resentful for seeing me at that door? What was going to happen with Esteban now that he had seen me as an incident and not a story? What was going to happen to me if my name was registered in another police situation? Even if I hadn't been the main one detained. I felt like I was accumulating papers against me and papers in a neighborhood way more than any apology. I slept badly that night with my heart racing because it was no longer just my pride that was at stake, it was my basic security. And the immediate threat became clear. If Brian came back with anger and Esteban was already determined to get me out with the police, I could be left without a roof over my head, without medical care, and without protection in a single move. Comments from Update 2. Anonymous user 1 says, so you were at Esteban's door after sending him lingerie photos with your belly and after he humiliated you with the sale items thing, and on top of that Brian shows up and you decide to say he wants to kill you so Esteban can come out as a hero. That's not survival anymore. That's a desperate soap opera to manipulate two men at the same time. And the worst part is that Esteban read you perfectly, called the police, and got you off his sidewalk too as if you were trash because he no longer buys your show. You ended up at the police station alone and broke, and you still want to sell it as an injustice of the universe, instead of accepting that you started the fire yourself. Response from the OP. It makes me laugh how you call it a soap opera for a woman to try to get out of a scandal alive with an unpredictable man on her and half the neighborhood watching. I said what I had to say to trigger a reaction, because when you're pregnant and a guy like Brian plants himself in front of you yelling, the threat exists even if it seems like entertainment to you. Esteban didn't read me perfectly. Esteban chose the most comfortable path for him, turning my life into a police formality and getting rid of the problem without getting his hands dirty. And yes, I ended up alone, because when someone is marked, everyone washes their hands with morality, but that doesn't turn my fear into a lie or my need into a sin. If you like to see someone sink and then say, "You deserve it," then you're not a judge, you're an audience. Anonymous User 2 says, Brian comes back and makes a scene because he sees you at another door, and instead of assuming that your life is a consequence of choosing the popular guy, you decide to use the pregnancy as a shield and Esteban as a bodyguard. With the story that they wanted to kill you. Esteban did the only smart thing, call the police and get you both out, because you bring problems stuck to you like gum. And the funniest part is that Brian gets arrested for an old warrant. I mean, the universe confirmed to you that you chose the worst, and you still keep looking for someone to rescue you. If you don't have a penny, it's because you dedicated yourself to playing with status instead of building something real. Response from the OP. You guys talk about choosing the popular guy as if life were a multiplication table where everything is calculated perfectly. And that's only said by someone who has never had to survive a neighborhood with real hierarchies. I didn't use the pregnancy as a shield. The pregnancy is my reality, and my reality implies that I can't let an agitated man corner me while everyone watches as if it were a show. Esteban wasn't smart. He was a coward with resources, because there's a huge difference between setting boundaries and dehumanizing someone by calling patrols to get rid of the nuisance. And if the universe confirmed something with the old warrant, it confirmed that Brian is a problem, not that I deserve to be left without a safety net. I'm not asking for a rescue out of whim. I'm demanding a minimum of humanity in a world where men disappear and then come back to shout as if your body were public property. Update 3. It's been 2 years since the last update, and there are things that time doesn't fix. It just makes them routine. My son was born, and he looks just like Brian. So similar that sometimes I feel like the mirror is playing a cruel joke on me. It's not just his face, it's his expression, that mix of innocence with a restless spark that scares me because I know where it comes from. Brian is still in and out of jail as if it were part of his calendar. And every time he appears in the neighborhood or is seen, the air becomes heavier for me. Because there is nothing more exhausting than raising a child with the shadow of a man who only appears to complicate your life. And yes, I know people call it karma, but raising a child is not a punishment. Raising a child is daily resistance. In these 2 years, I learned to count coins without crying, to stretch food without it being noticeable, to smile at my son, even if inside I'm thinking about bills. There are days when I look at myself and I don't recognize myself, because I was a woman who thought about status, and now I think about diapers and transportation. I'm not saying it as an empty complaint. I'm saying it because life changes you when you're left alone with a baby and with a story that nobody wants to carry with you. My family helps sometimes. But the help comes with that look of, have you learned your lesson? As if hunger were a pedagogical lesson. I became quieter, more strategic, because when you open your mouth, the world judges you. And I no longer had the energy to defend my story every day. Work didn't fall from the sky. It came as things do when you're desperate. Out of necessity, not out of pride. I ended up working cleaning the offices of Esteban's construction company. And if anyone thinks that's a nice coincidence, they don't understand how the circle closes in a neighborhood. I didn't look for it for romance, I looked for it because it was a job, because there was a salary, because my son doesn't eat excuses. The uniform was too big for me at first, and that made me angry because it was like wearing the physical proof of my fall. But I swallowed it because dignity is also built with survival, even if others call it humiliation. And I needed stability, even if it came from the place that hurt me the most. The first time I entered those offices, I smelled the smell of cleanliness mixed with money, that subtle difference between a poor place and a place where everything shines. I would mop the floor looking at orderly desks, huge screens, good machine coffee, and I would think about how Esteban had built an empire while I was lifting buckets. It's not envy, it's a clash of realities, because it's one thing for them to surpass you and another for them to pay you to clean their floors. But I did it with my head held high because my son doesn't deserve a mother who collapses every time life gets ironic. I kept telling myself that work doesn't define who I am, that it's just a phase. However, inside, every hallway felt like a silent slap in the face. At first, I thought that maybe Esteban would see me and at least something would move in him. Because, let's be honest, he cried for me on his knees. I didn't expect him to hug me or apologize, but I did expect human recognition, even if it was just a look. But reality was colder. Esteban would walk through those hallways as if I were a piece of furniture. Sometimes I would see him from afar in a suit, with that posture of a man who is in charge, and my chest would burn because he looked whole. I was bent over, cleaning in my uniform, and the scene seemed designed to humiliate me with precision. And the worst part is that it wasn't a loud humiliation, it was an invisible humiliation, one of those that only you understand, and that's why they hurt more. Because you have no one to fight against. Over time I found out that he got married because the model fiancée was no longer a promise, she was a wife. I saw her a couple of times enter the construction company with that elegance that people confuse with value, and her presence made everyone straighten up as if beauty were a hierarchy. I looked at her and felt that pang of ego, not because I hate her, but because I understand the symbolic. It was as if life had given Esteban a perfect showcase to display his triumph: wife, model, company, stable life. And I, next to him with a uniform and a bucket, was the shadow that doesn't match the photo. I swallowed that feeling because I didn't have the right to explode at a job where any explosion is paid for with dismissal, but the poison stays inside and accumulates. Then the blonde baby appeared, Esteban's son with her, and that image threw me off more than I expected. They carried him with that clean tenderness of a perfect family. And I saw the contrast as a cruel movie scene. Him with his baby, fair, me with my dark-haired son who looks just like Brian. It's not racism, it's life symbolism, because it seemed as if the universe had decided that Esteban would have the beautiful version of the future, and I would have the heavy version. I would watch from afar, trying not to show my face, because a mother can't afford to break down when she has to pay for food. But it hurt in a physical way, as if my stomach were being squeezed. And still, the most humiliating thing wasn't seeing them, it was seeing that he didn't even register me. There's a type of invisibility that's worse than rejection. And it's when the person who swore to love you doesn't recognize you even with the pain in front of you. Esteban would walk down the hallway, and I was literally in his path. And he would continue with his businessman's gaze, talking to people, smiling, and I was part of the floor. Sometimes I would imagine that he pretended not to recognize me to punish me, but then I understood that the ultimate cruelty is that maybe he really doesn't see me anymore, that his life is filled with new things and I was reduced to just another employee. That burned me because in my logic I was important, I was history, I was a wound. And for a wound to turn to dust is a form of defeat that doesn't appear in memes, but is felt in the body. Brian, meanwhile, continued to orbit like a toxic shadow. He'd get out of jail, disappear, reappear when he needed something, and every time I heard his name my throat would tighten. My son would ask about his dad with that cruel innocence that children have, and I had to invent answers that wouldn't break him. Because I'm not going to burden the child with my resentment. I'm not that kind of mother. I protect him even if it hurts me. But every time Brian entered and left my reality, I felt that my life couldn't close chapters. The past would sneak in through the window, and I had to sweep it up again and again. And that repetition takes away your energy to live. The worst part is that I myself, for a time, tried to convince myself that memories can be erased if one decides to. It worked for me as a survival mantra, because accepting that you humiliated someone and then ended up cleaning their offices is a blow that not everyone can withstand. I kept telling myself that the 4 years with Brian were a void, that the important thing was the now, that the past doesn't rule. But the past does rule when you don't have money, when you're hungry, when your bank account hits zero before the end of the month. There's no mantra that can withstand that, because hunger doesn't believe in phrases, and when hunger comes, it forces you to look at the whole path, not just the part that suits you. One day, while I was cleaning, a song came on a guard's or some worker's radio that repeats, "If I don't remember, it didn't happen." I felt my blood run cold because it was as if the universe were mocking me with the same phrase I used to pretend I could reset my story. My eyes welled up without permission, and I had to turn my face so no one would see, because crying in silence in a hallway of your ex's construction company is a humiliation you don't need to announce. I stood there with the mop in my hand, breathing as if the air were heavy, trying not to fall apart. And the worst part was realizing that, no matter how much I want to forget, my body does remember. I started to notice that my life had become a collection of cruel reminders. The uniform, the hallways, the blonde baby, the model wife, the son who looks just like Brian, the song on the radio. Everything seemed designed to tell me that my decisions left a mark. And I, who was always head held high, found myself measuring my pride by the price of milk. That's the real defeat, not a dramatic phrase, but the moment when you prioritize food over ego. Sometimes I imagined confronting Esteban, telling him to look at me, to recognize me, to remember. But then I would see his confidence, his environment, his life, and I would understand that if I spoke, he would most likely look at me as one looks at a problem from the past. And I wasn't going to give him that power of seeing me beg for humanity again. Besides, I couldn't risk the job because losing that salary meant putting my son at risk. So I became an expert at swallowing emotions without them showing, at taking a deep breath and continuing to mop. People think that's resignation, but in my head it was discipline. I was sustaining a life. I would tell myself that it didn't matter if Esteban saw me or not, because my goal wasn't his gaze, it was my stability. But then I would see him pass by with his family and the poison would return. Because I'm human, not a stone. And being human in silence is a painful art. No one applauds you for holding on. They just expect you to do it. Over time I understood something that hurt me to admit. Esteban didn't owe me a rescue. I owed my son structure. That idea rearranged me inside because it forced me to stop fantasizing about romantic justice. Brian would continue to be Brian in and out of jail. And I couldn't expect that story to give me anything good. Esteban would continue to be a businessman with a perfect family, and I couldn't expect him to give me back the place I myself despised. Life doesn't work as moral compensation, it works as accumulated consequence. And although it's hard for me to accept it without anger, I accepted it out of exhaustion, because fighting with the past takes away your strength to raise a child. That acceptance isn't peace, it's exhaustion with lucidity. Today my routine is simple and brutal. Work, raise, save what I can, avoid Brian when he reappears, protect my son from chaos. Esteban crosses my day like an elegant shadow, without recognizing me, and that hurts less when you're busy, but it hurts just the same when you're alone. Sometimes I wonder if my son when he grows up will inherit that dangerous shine of Brian's, and that fear keeps me awake at night, because I don't want to raise a man who disappears and comes back to shout. I want to raise someone different, and that responsibility weighs more than any nostalgia. The ending of all this isn't pretty, it's real. I'm no longer waiting for a miracle, I'm surviving with the dignity I can afford. Comments from Update 3. Anonymous User 1 says, "The karma here isn't poetic, it's mathematical. You left Esteban when he was crying on his knees to go with Brian for status. He got you pregnant and left. You came back offering personal services and sending lingerie photos with a belly. And now you clean the offices of the construction company of the guy you humiliated. On top of that, he walks by with his model wife and his blonde baby and doesn't even register you because he already erased you like a bad chapter. And you still cling to a song to pretend the past doesn't count when your bank account is screaming the opposite." Response from the OP. How easy it is to talk about mathematics when you're not the one who wakes up every day with a child to feed and a father who only shows up to be a nuisance. I didn't humiliate for sport. I made decisions with the information and the emotional hunger I had at the time, and the world doesn't give you a manual to choose perfectly. That Esteban is now a businessman and walks past me without looking doesn't make him a saint. It makes him someone who learned to punish with indifference, which is a very fine form of cruelty. The song isn't an excuse, it's a reminder of how one deceives oneself to survive when there's no safety net. And you guys use that to make fun because you love to feel superior. My bank account screams, yes, but it also screams my resistance because I'm still standing and that doesn't fit into your deserved narrative. Anonymous User 2 says, the saddest part is your son, because the child is not to blame for you choosing the guy who goes in and out of jail and now leaves you with questions of, where is my dad? And while you're consumed looking at Esteban's blonde baby as a symbol, your reality is that you're still orbiting around men. One abandons you and the other ignores you. If you had really matured, you would be focused on building your life away from both of them. Not working right at your ex's company and crying over a song in a hallway. Your dignity isn't bought with phrases, it's built with responsibility, and responsibility came to you late. Response from the OP. My son is precisely the reason I'm building, even if it seems unglamorous to you, because it's not an Instagram success story. I don't orbit for pleasure. I work where there's work, because rent and food aren't paid with a wounded pride. And that's the part you guys have a hard time understanding from your judge's chair. Looking at Esteban's blonde baby isn't a romantic obsession, it's a symbolic clash, because when life puts a contrast in front of your face, your mind processes it even if you don't want it to. And yes, responsibility came to me with a blow, as it does to many people, but it came, and here I am sustaining a life while Brian is still in and out of jail as if nothing. If it seems to you that crying in silence over a song makes me less, then you're not measuring maturity, you're measuring how much you enjoy seeing someone break without being seen.